If you believe families should not be torn apart by betrayal, bloodshed, and corruption, subscribe to this channel. But if you think it's acceptable to watch as lies consume everything, if you think silence means you're safe, then don't. Because this isn't just the story of the Solomons. This is the story of every family that chooses to look the other way, that turns their back on justice. You've been a silent witness to their downfall. Now it's your turn to decide. If you don't subscribe, you're complicit in every lie, every broken promise, every soul lost. Think carefully. Your inaction makes you guilty too. In the quiet outskirts of Greenvale, a picturesque suburban town, stood the Solomon Mansion, a sprawling estate that symbolized wealth, power, and prestige. It was the early 1990s, a time before the internet revolution, where secrets were hidden in the shadows and whispers traveled through backroom conversations. The Solomons were the epitome of success. Their family name was synonymous with elegance, their business empire unshakable, and their image as a benevolent force in the community unparalleled. The patriarch, Charles Solomon, was revered as a self-made man. Born into poverty, his rise to prominence was the stuff of legends, or so the public was led to believe. Charles was a towering figure with a sharp jawline and piercing blue eyes. His voice carried authority, and his charisma could fill a room. He was often photographed at charity events, shaking hands with mayors and governors, and cutting ribbons at community projects. His favorite mantra, spoken with conviction at every gala, was, "The Solomons build, we don't destroy." Then there was his wife, Margaret Solomon, the gracious matriarch who embodied class and sophistication. Always dressed in tailored suits and adorned with pearls, Margaret was the heart of every social gathering. She hosted lavish dinners in their grand dining hall, complete with crystal chandeliers and imported mahogany furniture. The town admired her poise, but behind her polished exterior, Margaret harbored a deep frustration, a simmering resentment over the sacrifices she'd made for the family's success. Their 4 children completed the picture of perfection. Evelyn, the eldest daughter, a lawyer with a razor-sharp intellect and a knack for winning impossible cases. Robert, the eldest son, who managed the family's shipping business and was seen as Charles's heir apparent. Henry, the quiet, calculating middle son, who handled the finances and had a reputation for being the most pragmatic. And finally, Daniel, the youngest, a charming but reckless 22-year-old who was known for his wild partying and impulsive behavior. The Solomons were untouchable, or so it seemed. Their business empire spanned real estate, shipping, and luxury goods. They owned half of Greenvale and controlled the other half through strategic partnerships and subtle intimidation. But the Solomon legacy was not as pristine as the world believed. Beneath the surface of their opulent lifestyle lay a labyrinth of secrets. Rumors whispered in hushed tones at local pubs hinted at the truth. Backdoor deals, bribes, and shady partnerships with unsavory figures. Whispers of smuggling operations tied to their shipping company began surfacing, though nothing was ever proven. Yet, what the world saw was carefully curated. On weekends, the family attended church together, sitting in the front pew, their polished smiles gleaming for all to see. The press frequently featured them in glowing profiles. The Solomons, a family to admire. Local TV ads often showcased Charles handing out scholarships to underprivileged students or donating funds for a new hospital wing. But at home, the cracks in the facade were impossible to ignore. The Solomons were far from the picture-perfect family they portrayed. Evelyn and Robert clashed frequently over business strategies, their arguments echoing through the mansion's marble halls. Henry, though outwardly composed, resented being overshadowed by his older siblings and kept his own counsel, meticulously planning for the day he could assert his dominance. Margaret, meanwhile, drowned her dissatisfaction in fine wine, often retreating to her private study to avoid the growing tension in the household. Daniel, the youngest, was the family's Achilles heel. His reckless spending, drug-fueled parties, and brushes with the law often threatened to tarnish the Solomons' reputation. Charles had spent a fortune covering up Daniel's indiscretions, but the young man's antics were growing harder to contain. The Solomons' carefully constructed world was like a house of cards. One wrong move, one tiny gust of wind, and it would all come crashing down. and that gust was already on its way. Behind the marble walls of the Solomon mansion, a shadowy empire flourished, one that thrived not on the values of hard work and integrity that Charles Solomon preached to the world, but on a foundation of deception, crime, and corruption. The Solomons were masters of manipulation, their wealth built on an intricate web of illegal enterprises that spanned continents. At the heart of their empire was the family's shipping business, Solomon Global Exports, which served as both a legitimate venture and a perfect cover for their illicit dealings. Beneath the pristine cargo manifests and meticulously kept records lay shipments that never passed through customs, containing everything from stolen art to untraceable weapons. Each family member played a role in the dark empire, whether willingly or out of obligation. Charles, the architect of their operations, was the puppeteer, pulling strings from the shadows. His connections with powerful officials ensured that investigations were quietly shelved and inconvenient witnesses disappeared without a trace. He was ruthless when it came to protecting the family's interests, and his network of loyal enforcers ensured that no loose ends remained untied. Margaret, though outwardly uninvolved, had her own part to play. She used her social influence to gather intelligence, subtly coercing prominent figures into favors or silence. Behind the warmth of her charity events lay carefully planned meetings, where deals were made and debts were called in. Evelyn, the eldest daughter, served as the family's legal shield. While her public image was that of a brilliant attorney who championed justice, she was deeply entrenched in the family's criminal operations. She carefully constructed airtight legal defenses for their front businesses and ensured that any accusations against the Solomons were quickly dismissed. Her sharp mind and relentless determination made her both a formidable ally and a dangerous adversary. Robert, the heir to the throne, managed the day-to-day operations of the shipping empire. He oversaw the logistics of their smuggling routes, negotiating deals with dangerous players in the black market. Despite his outward confidence, Robert harbored deep insecurities, constantly seeking his father's approval while fearing that he would never measure up to Charles's legacy. Henry, the middle son, was the financial mastermind. He handled the family's money laundering operations, creating a labyrinth of offshore accounts and shell companies that made their wealth nearly impossible to trace. His analytical nature and meticulous attention to detail were invaluable, but his cold, calculating demeanor often alienated him from the rest of the family. Daniel, the youngest and most unpredictable of the siblings, was given the menial tasks that kept him away from the critical operations. However, his reckless behavior and impulsive decisions frequently jeopardized the family's carefully constructed facade. Their empire ran smoothly, each member playing their part in a well-oiled machine. But even the most flawless machinery is vulnerable to failure. It started with a routine operation, a shipment of priceless artifacts stolen from a European museum. The artifacts, destined for a private collector willing to pay an astronomical sum, were loaded onto one of Solomon Global's cargo ships. The plan was simple. The ship would dock at an unregistered port, the artifacts would be offloaded, and the transaction would take place far from prying eyes. But something went wrong. One of the crew members, a young sailor desperate for cash, decided to tip off the authorities. Whether he acted out of guilt or greed was never known, but his betrayal set off a chain of events that threatened to unravel the entire Solomon Empire. The ship was raided just as it approached the port. The artifacts were seized, and several crew members were arrested. Though none of them were directly linked to the Solomons, the authorities began digging deeper into Solomon Global's operations. Panic spread through the family like wildfire. Charles, furious at the breach in security, ordered an immediate response. The sailor who had betrayed them was found dead within days, his body discovered floating in the harbor. Officially, it was ruled an accident, but those who knew the Solomons understood the truth. Evelyn worked tirelessly to contain the damage, fabricating documents and bribing officials to steer the investigation away from the family. Robert scrambled to reroute their shipments and secure new smuggling routes, while Henry worked overtime to conceal their financial tracks. But the damage was done. The raid marked the first crack in the Solomons' empire, and with it came a growing sense of unease. For years, they had operated in the shadows, untouchable and unseen. Now, the spotlight was inching closer, and the family's secrets were at risk of exposure. And then there was Daniel. In the chaos that followed the raid, Daniel made a critical mistake. Desperate to prove himself to his family, he took it upon himself to handle a separate deal, a small shipment of contraband that was supposed to be inconspicuous. But Daniel's arrogance and lack of experience led him straight into a trap set by a rival family. The shipment was seized, and word of the Solomons' vulnerability began to spread through the criminal underworld. What followed was a domino effect. Rivals who had long feared the Solomons now saw an opportunity to strike. Investigators who had been paid to look the other way began asking questions. And within the family, tensions reached a boiling point. Charles, desperate to maintain control, became increasingly authoritarian, demanding absolute loyalty and obedience. Evelyn and Robert grew resentful of their father's harsh tactics, while Henry quietly plotted his own escape plan, anticipating the collapse of the empire. The Solomons' carefully constructed facade was beginning to crumble, and with it, their dark empire. But the worst was yet to come. Every empire, no matter how grand, has its weak link. For the Solomons, that weak link was Daniel. Youngest of the Solomon siblings, Daniel had always been restless, impulsive, and eager to prove himself. His recklessness, once dismissed as youthful folly, now posed a serious threat to the family's empire. After the disastrous raid that shook the Solomons to their core, tensions were high. Rival families circled like vultures, the authorities grew more inquisitive, and within the family itself, paranoia simmered just beneath the surface. But Daniel, blinded by ambition and a desperate need for validation, believed he could salvage their reputation with a bold move. The opportunity presented itself when Daniel learned of an unclaimed cargo of stolen jewels, a shipment that had been abandoned after its original buyer was arrested. Daniel saw this as his chance to prove his worth. Without consulting his father or siblings, he orchestrated a deal with a low-level intermediary, a man known only as Victor, to secure the jewels and sell them to a new buyer. But Daniel underestimated Victor. Victor was not just an intermediary. He was an informant for the authorities, feeding them information on criminal operations in exchange for protection. The deal was a trap, set up to ensnare whoever dared to claim the jewels. Unaware of this, Daniel moved forward with the transaction, believing he was outsmarting everyone. The meeting took place in a desolate warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a setting straight out of a crime drama. The warehouse was damp and dimly lit, its walls covered in graffiti, with broken crates and rusted machinery scattered about. Daniel, dressed in a leather jacket and jeans, arrived with the confidence of someone who thought he was in control. He carried a briefcase filled with cash, believing he was about to make the deal of a lifetime. But Victor, lurking in the shadows, had other plans. As Daniel handed over the briefcase and inspected the jewels, a team of plainclothes officers stormed the warehouse. Chaos erupted. Daniel, caught off guard, dropped the jewels and made a run for it, barely escaping through a side door. In his panic, Daniel left behind more than just the jewels. He left fingerprints. The authorities now had tangible evidence linking someone to the Solomons' operations. Worse still, Victor, eager to save his own skin, began feeding them details about the family's dealings. Though he didn't know the full scope of their empire, what he did know was damning enough. But the worst mistake wasn't Daniel's fingerprints. While fleeing the scene, Daniel had been seen. An innocent bystander, a young mechanic named Jack, had been working late in a nearby garage when he noticed the commotion at the warehouse. Curious, Jack had stepped outside and spotted Daniel sprinting away, his face illuminated by a passing car's headlights. Jack, oblivious to the danger, mentioned what he had seen to a coworker the next morning. Word quickly spread, and before long, it reached the wrong ears. The Solomons enforcers, tasked with cleaning up Daniel's mess, were dispatched to track down anyone who might have seen or heard anything about the botched deal. When Charles learned about Jack, he knew they had a problem. Jack, an honest and hard-working man in his late 20s, had no idea who the Solomons were or what he had stumbled upon. But Charles couldn't take any chances. The family's rule was clear: no loose ends. What followed was a chilling example of how far the Solomons would go to protect their empire. Evelyn, tasked with handling the legal fallout, argued against drastic measures. She believed they could intimidate Jack into silence without resorting to violence. But Charles, now consumed by paranoia, overruled her. Robert and one of the family's enforcers, a cold and efficient man named Victoriano, were sent to deal with Jack. They approached him under the guise of potential customers, luring him to an isolated location. There, they confronted him, demanding to know what he had seen and who he had told. Jack's answers didn't matter. Once it was clear that Jack couldn't be trusted to keep quiet, Victoriano ended his life with chilling precision. Jack's body was disposed of in a nearby river, his disappearance staged to look like an accident. The Solomons believed they had contained the situation, but they had underestimated the ripple effects of their actions. Jack's co-workers, uneasy about his sudden disappearance, began asking questions. The police, still investigating the raid, took notice. And within the family, the rift between Evelyn and Charles deepened. Evelyn, disgusted by her father's decision, began to question her loyalty to the family. Robert, haunted by his role in Jack's death, turned to alcohol to numb his guilt. Daniel, oblivious to the consequences of his actions, remained as reckless as ever. The botched deal and Jack's murder marked a turning point for the Solomons. Their empire, once untouchable, was now fragile and exposed. And though they didn't know it yet, the seeds of their downfall had been sown. The Solomons thought they had eliminated all loose ends. Jack was gone, his death a carefully staged accident, and Daniel's reckless mistake was buried, along with a growing mountain of guilt. But just as they began to breathe again, a new threat emerged from the shadows. It began with a letter, folded neatly into an unmarked envelope and slid under the front door of the Solomons' mansion. The handwriting was elegant, the kind that suggested patience and intelligence. The note was brief but chilling. I know what you did. If you want to keep your secrets buried, we need to talk. Bring $100,000 to the phone booth on 5th and Main at midnight tomorrow. Come alone. No police. The letter set the family on edge. Who had sent it? Could it be someone who had seen Jack's murder? Or was it a bluff, someone fishing for a reaction? Charles, Evelyn, Robert, and Daniel gathered in the study, the room thick with cigar smoke and unease. Charles, always the commanding presence, dismissed it as a hoax. People bluff all the time, he said gruffly, his tone dripping with confidence. We don't negotiate with cowards hiding behind letters. But Evelyn, ever the voice of reason, argued otherwise. What if they know more than we think? We can't afford to be careless, not now. Robert, nursing a glass of whiskey, said nothing. His hands trembled slightly, betraying the storm brewing inside him. Daniel, on the other hand, was visibly shaken. For the first time, his usual bravado was gone, replaced by a look of genuine fear. Paranoia began to creep into the room. Evelyn eyed Daniel with suspicion, her voice low but sharp. Are you sure you didn't leave anything else behind? Daniel bristled. I told you, I ran. I didn't stop to look back. Charles, ever the enforcer, shut down the conversation with a thunderous voice. Enough. We'll handle this like we've handled everything else. No one threatens the Solomons. But the letter was only the beginning. The next day, another letter arrived. This one contained a photograph, grainy but unmistakable. It was a picture of Daniel fleeing the warehouse, his face partially illuminated by the car headlights. Beneath the photo was a single line. I wonder how long this will stay a secret. Charles's confidence began to crack. Evelyn, ever the strategist, insisted they meet the sender. If they know this much, we need to know who they are. Ignoring them could make things worse. Reluctantly, Charles agreed. At midnight, Robert was sent to the designated phone booth, a decrepit relic of the 90s sitting beneath a flickering streetlight. Robert waited, his nerves fraying with each passing second. Then the phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm. It belonged to a man who knew he was in control. You Solomons think you're untouchable, the voice said, laced with menace. But you're not. Bring the money tomorrow, or I'll make sure the whole city knows what you've done. Before Robert could respond, the line went dead. When Robert returned to the mansion and relayed the message, the family was in disarray. The stranger clearly knew more than they had anticipated. But who was he? As the days passed, more letters arrived, each one more incriminating than the last. The stranger seemed to know everything. The smuggling routes, the money laundering fronts, even details about Jack's murder. The family's paranoia grew. Evelyn began to suspect Robert, believing his guilt over Jack's death had driven him to betray them. Charles, in turn, accused Evelyn of conspiring with their enemies to seize control of the empire. And Daniel, already the scapegoat, found himself increasingly isolated. The stranger's demands escalated. It was no longer just about money, it was about control. He wanted a share of their operations, a seat at the table. The Solomons, desperate to protect their empire, hatched a plan. They decided to pay the ransom but used the meeting as an opportunity to eliminate the threat. Victoriano, their trusted enforcer, was tasked with identifying and silencing the stranger. But when the meeting finally took place in an abandoned parking lot on the outskirts of town, the Solomons were met with a chilling surprise. The stranger didn't come alone. He arrived with a small army of men, each one armed and ready for a fight. And as he stepped into the light, his face was revealed. A face none of them recognized. He was an outsider, but one with a grudge. His name was Marcus Lyle, a former associate of one of their rivals, the same rival family that had been crushed years earlier by the Solomons' rise to power. Marcus had spent years in the shadows, gathering evidence, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Now, the Solomons were at his mercy. And though they didn't know it yet, Marcus wasn't just after money or control, he was after revenge. Make sure to subscribe now to stay updated with the latest uploads. Don't miss a single video. More twists, more secrets, and more shocking moments are coming. If you walk away now, you'll miss the unraveling, the shocking twists of our everyday stories. Stay with us, or be left behind in the dark. The Solomons had always prided themselves on loyalty, a tightly knit family bound by blood and secrecy. But loyalty was a fragile thing, and under the weight of paranoia and fear, it began to crumble. The arrival of Marcus Lyle had already thrown the family into chaos, but the true storm was brewing within their own walls. It started subtly, with whispers and side glances. Evelyn noticed Charles spending more time locked in his study, poring over old ledgers and making phone calls in hushed tones. Robert, once the quiet mediator, grew increasingly distant, retreating into the solace of his whiskey glass. Daniel, guilt-ridden and reckless, began disappearing for hours at a time without explanation. But the real betrayal came from someone none of them suspected. Evelyn herself? For years, Evelyn had harbored her own ambitions, plans to take over the family empire and steer it in a direction she believed was more sustainable. She had grown tired of Charles's iron rule and his refusal to adapt to the changing times. The arrival of Marcus presented an opportunity, and Evelyn, ever the strategist, decided to seize it. Late one night, while the rest of the family slept, Evelyn made her move. She contacted Marcus using a burner phone, arranging a secret meeting at a diner on the outskirts of town. The two met in a dimly lit booth, the hum of the jukebox masking their conversation. Evelyn, poised and calculating, offered Marcus a deal. She would help him dismantle the Solomons' operations from within in exchange for a significant cut of the profits and a guarantee of safety for herself. Marcus, intrigued by the proposal, agreed, though he made it clear he trusted no one. Unbeknownst to Evelyn, someone had followed her to the diner. Daniel, desperate to prove his worth to the family, had been tailing her ever since he noticed her odd behavior. From a shadowy corner of the parking lot, he watched as Evelyn and Marcus shook hands, sealing their pact. Back at the mansion, Daniel confronted Evelyn in a fit of rage. The argument quickly turned explosive, their voices echoing through the grand halls. Charles and Robert burst into the room, demanding an explanation. Evelyn, cornered, tried to spin her actions as a necessary evil. "You think this family can survive without change?" she spat, her voice cutting through the tension. "Marcus is dangerous, but he's also an opportunity. We need him more than he needs us." But Charles was unmoved. His face darkened with fury as he declared, "You've betrayed this family, Evelyn. There's no coming back from that." The confrontation fractured the family even further. Robert, usually the peacemaker, found himself torn between loyalty to Charles and sympathy for Evelyn's pragmatic approach. Daniel, emboldened by his discovery, saw an opportunity to rise in his father's esteem and began scheming against Evelyn. Meanwhile, Marcus, ever the manipulator, began playing the family members against one another. He fed Evelyn false promises, stoking her ambition, while simultaneously feeding information to Daniel to keep him loyal. As the days passed, more secrets came to light. Evelyn wasn't the only one with hidden agendas. Robert had been embezzling money from the family's accounts to fund a secret gambling addiction. Daniel had been blackmailing a rival gang for protection money, a reckless move that had painted a target on the Solomons' backs. Even Charles, the family's stoic patriarch, was hiding something, a long-standing affair with a young associate that threatened to destroy his reputation. The mansion became a powder keg, every interaction charged with suspicion and resentment. Arguments erupted at the dinner table, the once grand meals now overshadowed by veiled accusations and bitter silences. The family was unraveling, and Marcus was tightening his grip. Evelyn, realizing she had underestimated Marcus' cunning, began to regret her alliance. But it was too late. Marcus had gained access to the Solomons' accounts and connections, using Evelyn as a pawn to position himself as the new power in the underworld. The Solomons' empire, once so formidable, was crumbling from within. And as the family descended into chaos, Marcus prepared to deliver the final blow, a move that would ensure their complete destruction. The cracks in the Solomons' empire, once hidden behind layers of wealth and power, now spread wide open for the world to see. Marcus Lyle, the cunning outsider, had been patient. He waited for the perfect moment to strike, and when he did, it was devastating. It began with a single envelope, delivered to the city's most prominent investigative journalist. Inside were documents so damning they seemed almost fabricated, bank statements detailing money laundering, lists of bribed officials, and photographs of secret meetings. The Solomons' facade of success and charity was ripped away in an instant. The story broke like a thunderclap. Newspapers splashed headlines like, "Beneath the Solomons' Gilded Empire, Corruption, Crime, and Chaos," across their front pages. The nightly news broadcasts were dominated by the scandal, with commentators dissecting every sordid detail. For the Solomons, the fallout was immediate and overwhelming. Investigators raided their offices, seizing computers, ledgers, and documents. Protesters gathered outside their corporate headquarters, waving signs demanding justice. Even their closest allies distanced themselves, issuing carefully worded statements condemning corruption. Inside the Solomon mansion, the mood was one of sheer panic. Charles barked orders at his lawyers, demanding they suppress the evidence. Evelyn paced the room, trying to devise a strategy, while Robert sank deeper into his guilt and shame. Only Daniel remained silent, his face pale as he realized the implications of their exposure. But as the family scrambled to contain the damage, the truth began to emerge. The leak had come from within. Marcus' partnership with Evelyn had given him access to critical information, but the final betrayal came from someone even closer. It was Daniel. Desperate to save himself after his reckless mistakes, he had secretly passed information to Marcus, hoping to negotiate his own immunity. He had underestimated Marcus' ambition, failing to see that the man would use the information to destroy the entire family. The media frenzy only grew. Reporters dug into every aspect of the Solomons' lives, uncovering decades of secrets. Charles's affair became public knowledge, humiliating the once revered patriarch. Evelyn's alliance with Marcus was exposed, branding her as the ultimate traitor. Robert's embezzlement scandal surfaced, painting him as a weak link in the family chain. Meanwhile, federal investigators pieced together the Solomons' criminal enterprise, building a case that would lead to arrests and lengthy prison sentences. As the walls closed in, the family's unity shattered completely. Charles, once the unshakable leader, began to unravel. He accused Evelyn of conspiring with Marcus to overthrow him, hurling accusations and insults during heated arguments. Evelyn fought back, blaming Charles for his inflexibility and outdated methods. Robert, overwhelmed by guilt, confessed to his embezzlement in a desperate attempt to clear his conscience. His confession only deepened the rift, further isolating him from the rest of the family. As for Daniel, the weight of his betrayal grew unbearable. The youngest Solomon, who had always sought approval and validation, now found himself ostracized. The others regarded him with a mix of anger and contempt, refusing to acknowledge his presence. The Solomons, once a symbol of wealth and power, now faced public disgrace. Their mansion, a sprawling estate that had once been a sanctuary, became a prison. They stayed behind locked gates, avoiding the paparazzi and protesters who camped outside. But the worst was yet to come. Marcus, satisfied with the chaos he had unleashed, wasn't done. He had one final move to make. A revelation so shocking it would ensure the Solomons' downfall was complete. The Solomons were no strangers to betrayal, but the exposure of their empire had left them vulnerable in ways they had never imagined. The paranoia that had simmered beneath the surface now boiled over, consuming the family from within. What began as whispered accusations and cold stares would soon spiral into an all-out bloodbath. Inside the Solomon mansion, the air was heavy with fear and distrust. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow flickering against the walls seemed to signal impending doom. Marcus Lyle, the outsider, had vanished from view, but his presence loomed large. He had sown chaos and retreated, confident that the family would destroy itself in his absence. It started with Charles. The once proud patriarch, now a shell of his former self, became consumed by the idea that Evelyn had orchestrated their downfall. He locked himself in his study, poring over financial records and old correspondence, searching for proof of her betrayal. Evelyn, meanwhile, had grown increasingly desperate. She began meeting secretly with her personal bodyguard, devising a plan to eliminate Marcus and reclaim what little power she could. She knew Charles suspected her, and she was prepared to defend herself at any cost. Robert, the eldest son, had always been the family's fixer, the one who cleaned up their messes. But this time, the mess was too big, even for him. The weight of their exposed secrets and the public humiliation drove him to the edge. He drank heavily, his once sharp mind dulled by despair. In his drunken stupor, he began to lash out, accusing both Charles and Evelyn of abandoning him when he needed them most. Then there was Daniel, the youngest, and now the most hated. Solomon had been ostracized since the revelation of his betrayal. Isolated and racked with guilt, Daniel began hearing whispers in the shadows, voices urging him to take drastic action to prove his loyalty. The breaking point came one stormy night. The family had gathered in the mansion's grand dining room, a rare occurrence in the weeks since the scandal broke. Tensions were high, and the conversation quickly turned into a shouting match. Charles accused Evelyn of working with Marcus to destroy the family. Evelyn fired back, revealing that she knew about Charles's decades-old affair with a business rival's wife, a secret she had kept to maintain their public image. Robert, in a drunken haze, threw a glass against the wall, shattering it into pieces and declaring that he had lost everything because of their greed and lies. And then, Daniel snapped. Fueled by a mix of anger and fear, he pulled a gun from beneath the table, a weapon he had stolen from the family's safe. He aimed it at Charles, accusing his father of being the root of all their problems. Before anyone could react, a shot rang out. Chaos erupted as the family members scattered, screaming and ducking for cover. In the ensuing melee, Evelyn grabbed a knife from the kitchen and lunged at Daniel, but Robert, in a rare moment of clarity, tackled her to the ground. Charles, clutching a bleeding wound in his shoulder, tried to crawl to safety, only to be confronted by his youngest son, eyes wild with rage. As the storm outside raged, the mansion became a battlefield. Family alliances crumbled as years of resentment and secrets spilled out. Robert turned on Daniel, wresting the gun from his grip and firing wildly. Evelyn, injured but alive, used the distraction to retreat to her room, where she kept a hidden stash of cash and a second weapon. Meanwhile, Marcus watched from the shadows. He had returned to the mansion, slipping past the distracted guards. Unbeknownst to the family, he had been orchestrating this finale all along, feeding them information and stoking their fears. As the Solomons tore each other apart, Marcus moved through the house like a phantom, collecting incriminating evidence and planting fake documents that would further implicate them in the eyes of the authorities. By the time the storm passed, the Solomon family was in ruins. Charles lay dead in the study, his blood pooling on the expensive Persian rug. Robert was found slumped against the grand staircase, clutching a gun with trembling hands. Daniel's lifeless body was discovered in the dining room, a knife still clutched in his hand. Evelyn, the lone survivor, staggered out of the mansion at dawn, her clothes soaked in blood. She looked up at the media frenzy outside the gates, her face a mask of shock and despair. And Marcus? He disappeared once more, leaving behind a legacy of destruction. The documents he planted ensured that Evelyn would take the fall for the massacre, sealing the Solomon family's fate. The Solomon family's legacy, built over decades of cunning, corruption, and cruelty, had crumbled in a single night. The sprawling mansion, once a symbol of power and prestige, now stood silent and blood-stained. The storm that had raged outside was gone, but inside, the tempest of betrayal and violence had left a deeper scar. Evelyn Solomon, the last surviving member of the family, was taken into custody that morning. Her bloodied clothes, wide eyes, and incoherent ramblings painted a picture of a woman unhinged, but her story was far from over. As investigators combed through the ruins of the Solomon estate, they uncovered damning evidence, planted meticulously by Marcus Lyle. Bank statements, fraudulent contracts, and personal letters pointed directly to Evelyn as the orchestrator of a criminal empire. But the deeper they dug, the clearer it became that someone else had been pulling the strings all along. The mastermind was not Marcus, nor Evelyn, nor any member of the Solomon family. It was someone they had never suspected, someone who had watched their every move, waited for the perfect moment, and struck with precision. Jameson, the family's longtime butler, was an unassuming figure in the chaos of the Solomon household. Quiet, efficient, and loyal, or so they thought. In truth, Jameson had been biding his time for decades. He had seen the Solomons at their worst, witnessed their greed, their betrayals, and their sins. And he had made it his mission to dismantle them from within. Years earlier, Jameson's family had been ruined by a ruthless Solomon business deal, leaving him orphaned and destitute. Taken in as a servant, he had quietly vowed revenge. Over the years, he collected their secrets, documented their crimes, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. Using Marcus as a pawn, Jameson set the plan into motion. It was he who had first contacted Marcus, feeding him just enough information to manipulate him into becoming an accomplice. Every move, every revelation, every betrayal was orchestrated by the man who had stood in the background, invisible to the family he despised. Evelyn, desperate to clear her name, pieced together the truth while in her prison cell. When the authorities questioned Jameson, he feigned ignorance, playing the role of the loyal servant to perfection. But Evelyn, now a shadow of her former self, demanded a meeting with Jameson. Their confrontation was chilling. Evelyn, once proud and untouchable, sat across from Jameson, shackled and broken. Jameson, calm and composed, revealed the full extent of his plan. He spoke with a quiet satisfaction, recounting how he had manipulated every member of the family, exploited their weaknesses, and watched as they destroyed themselves. "You thought you were untouchable," Jameson said, his voice cold and measured. "But you were blind. You never saw me, never considered that someone like me could bring you down. That was your greatest mistake." Evelyn's screams echoed through the prison halls as Jameson walked away, leaving her to face the consequences of a life built on lies and betrayal. The fallout was swift and merciless. The Solomon estate was seized, their assets liquidated, and their name became synonymous with scandal and tragedy. Marcus Lyle disappeared once again, his role in the Solomon downfall remaining a mystery to the public. As for Jameson, he vanished into obscurity, his mission complete. Some say he retired to a quiet village, living out his days in peace. Others believe he continued his crusade against the corrupt elite, a shadowy figure in the fight for justice. In the end, the Solomons were undone not by an outsider, but by their own hubris, greed, and blindness. The massacre was the culmination of years of deceit and betrayal, a tragic reminder that even the most powerful can fall when their foundations are built on lies. The Solomon mansion, once a beacon of wealth and influence, became a symbol of their demise. Abandoned and overgrown, It stood as a ghostly reminder of a family destroyed from within. Final reflection. As we close the chapter on the Solomons, their rise and fall leaves us with haunting questions. How could a family so powerful be so blind to the dangers lurking within their own home? Was Jameson justified in his actions, or did his revenge make him just as ruthless as the family he sought to destroy? What do you think, viewers? 1. If you were in Jameson's position, would you have done the same to avenge your family? Or did he take things too far by orchestrating such a brutal downfall? 2. Was Evelyn truly evil, or just a product of her upbringing in a family built on corruption and greed? 3. Do you think Marcus Lyle deserved to get away, or should he have faced justice alongside the Solomons? 4. Is it ever possible to dismantle such powerful families without resorting to manipulation and violence, as Jameson did? 5. And finally, who was the true villain in this story? Was it Jameson, the Solomons, or perhaps all of them in their own way? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Who do you side with, and what would you have done differently? The story may be over, but the debate has just begun. Let's be honest, if you've made it this far into the twisted saga of the Solomons, you know this isn't just any story. It's a deep dive into betrayal, power, and the dark truths we all fear might lurk behind closed doors. But here's the thing. If you walk away now, without subscribing to this channel, aren't you turning a blind eye to the very injustices that tore the Solomons apart? Think about it. Jameson fought against a family that thrived on secrets and lies. He exposed the hidden truths they tried so hard to bury. And here you are, uncovering these truths with us. To not subscribe would be like standing in the shadows, refusing to shed light on these dark corners of human nature. So, what kind of person are you? Someone who supports revealing the truth, no matter how ugly? Or someone who turns away, leaving stories like this untold? If you believe in exposing corruption, greed, and the cost of unchecked power, then hit that subscribe button now. Because together, we'll keep uncovering stories that make you think, question, and shiver. Don't just watch. Be part of the movement. Subscribe now, and don't let the darkness win.